The gentleman from New York is now recognized. Gentleman from New York is now recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Gentlewoman from Washington is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am so proud today to stand here to support H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, and I want to congratulate my incredible colleague, Congresswoman Sewell, for her leadership. When Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it was a recognition that systemic discrimination based on race continued to deny people the right to vote. And as an organizer, I understand the Voting Rights Act as a victory that was hard fought by black activists like Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker, and of course, our esteemed colleague, Representative Lewis, who devoted their lives to fighting for the right to vote. And it was a victory of the movement that recognized that this right to vote is absolutely fundamental to our concept and our actualization of democracy. But unfortunately, we have not followed with the same courage. Instead, since 2013, states have enacted laws that have suppressed voting rights across the country, and today, half of the country faces stricter voting regulations than they did 9 years ago. If we want a true democracy, Mr. Speaker, we must protect the right to vote for all. And this bill is critical to doing that. Thank you.
The gentleman from Georgia is now recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is now recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished Majority Leader, Mr. Hoyer.
The gentleman from Maryland, the Majority Leader, is now recognized.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the chairman of the Judiciary Committee for yielding this time, and I thank him for his leadership. And of course, I thank Terry Sewell, who is from Selma, Alabama, who has been a fighter for voting rights all of her life. I thank her for sponsoring this bill along with myself and so many others. It was in Selma in 1965 that another friend and one of our dearest colleagues, John Lewis, was nearly beaten to death for having the audacity to demand the right to vote, the right to register, the right to participate in a meaningful way in our democracy. That year, after that bloody Sunday in March of 1965, and the later march to Montgomery that followed soon after, Congress enacted the Voting Rights Act to protect against voter suppression and disenfranchisement. One of its core provisions required that the Federal Justice Department pre-clear any changes to voting rules in jurisdictions that had a history of discrimination and voter suppression. Let me, as an aside, say that these elections are federal elections. So very frankly, my constituents have an interest in making sure that constituents of every other district have an opportunity to have their voice heard. This is not a states' rights issue, as the administration puts forth. This is an issue of America's values as a democracy, which is that all Americans, and that was not always the case. We had to amend the Constitution of the United States in order to effect that end, that all Americans have the right and ought to be facilitated in exercising that right to vote. And sadly, we know that notwithstanding the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that state after state, jurisdiction after jurisdiction, not solely in the South, adopted policies aimed at preventing the exercise of the franchise, of preventing the ability to register to vote, and to neuter the vote being cast by redistricting efforts that, in effect, put people in a place where they could not elect the person of their choice. As a result, millions of Americans, after the Voting Rights Act was adopted, were finally able to vote and have their voices heard in their democracy. However, my friends, we ought to be chastened as we consider this legislation in knowing that for 100 years after the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments were adopted, for 100 years, for a century, it was still necessary for the John Lewises and the Martin Luther Kings to march. Some gave their lives to redeem that promise that so many gave their lives to ensure. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court struck down the formula for that pre-clearance process in 2013 and charged Congress with updating it. We have responded this day to that charge. Under the previous Republican-led Congress, that charge was ignored. Again, I would ask my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle to think of their failure to act. Ronald Reagan said to Gorbachev, "Tear down that wall." Today, we have an opportunity to tear down the wall of discrimination and exclusion to millions of Americans who have been confronted with policies that make it more difficult for them to vote. I hope the Senate will join us in tearing down this wall of discrimination, oppression, and exclusion. I continue to believe that the decision made by the Supreme Court was a bad decision, which did not reflect the reality of the success of the pre-clearance provisions in the Voting Rights Act. Indeed, Justice Ginsburg pointed out in her dissent that, and I quote, "Throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked, is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes, is like throwing out your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet." Today, the Democratic-led House will vote to restore the full force of the Voting Rights Act, and I hope every Republican will join us if they want to ensure that discriminatory practices do not prevent citizens from voting. We have given this bill the designation of H.R. 4. I said in a press conference just a little time ago, H.R. 4. H.R. for the people, whether you spell it F-O-R or F-O-U-R. This is for the people, for our democracy, for justice, for inclusion. We have given this bill the designation of H.R. 4 appropriately because it's one of our most important pieces of legislation. Along with H.R. 1, the For the People Act, which contained a number of provisions strengthening ballot access, making voter registration automatic, and expanding early voting. H.R. 4 is part of Democrats' effort to protect Americans' fundamental right to vote. H.R. 4, my colleagues, restores the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. As you take your card and contemplate putting it in the slot and pushing either the green button or the red button, reflect upon those who died. Not only in the civil rights movement, but those who died on foreign shores, defending freedom and democracy. Because as you vote today, you will be voting to defend or to ignore the fundamental formula for democracy, which is having people's vote count. The pre-clearance formula, requiring reasonable public notice before changes to voting laws or regulations permitting the Attorney General to request the presence of election observers anywhere there is a threat of racial discrimination at the ballot box. These are not just state elections, I tell my friends. These are elections which impact my constituents in your state and every other state when they elect members of Congress in the United States Senate. and increasing accessibility and protections for Native Americans and Alaska Native voters. Again, I want to thank Representative Sewell, her leadership in this effort, and John Lewis, and so many other hearings, my friend Jim Clyburn, the Democratic whip, who fought for voting rights, for all those of African American descent who fought for voting rights, of Native Americans, the first two of women of whom we have in the Congress now. I thank Chairman Nadler for working closely with Terry Sewell and others to strengthen this legislation by including language to ensure that jurisdictions that purge voter rolls or reduce early voting opportunities are subject to pre-clearance requirements. It's very nice to say, well, you can file a suit after the election is over. You may not have the money to do that, and in any event, it is a fait accompli. It is too late. That's why pre-clearance has been honored for half a century, and that's why it's so sad that the Supreme Court set it aside. And of course, I want to thank one more time my dear friend, who throughout his lifetime has held up the beloved community. Voting rights is part of that beloved community. At Selma, 54 years ago, John risked his future, his life, and his limb so every American could cast a vote. Today, 434 of us ought to join John Lewis. Not walking across a bridge with Alabama troopers waiting to beat us and confront us. But that little box where we have the right to vote. Nobody can stop us from voting in that box today. Let's make sure that nobody stops any of our fellow Americans from putting their card in that voting slot and making democracy all that our founders promised it to be. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Maryland yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized. The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, Representative Jeffries.
The gentleman from New York, Representative Jeffries, is now recognized.
The right to vote is precious and central to the integrity of our democracy. It is not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. It is an American issue. The Republican Party used to support the unfettered right to vote. In fact, every single time the Voting Rights Act has been reauthorized, it was signed by a Republican president. 1970, Richard Nixon. 1975, Gerald Ford. 1982, Ronald Reagan. 2006, George W. Bush. The unfettered right to vote should be a bipartisan issue. But the party of Lincoln is gone. The party of Reagan is gone. The party of McCain is gone. Voter suppression is not a legitimate electoral tactic. It is a stain on our democracy, and it must be crushed. Vote yes on H.R. 4.
Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is now recognized.
Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee.
Gentlewoman from California is now recognized.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the chairman for yielding and bringing H.R. 40 to this floor. Also, I'd like to thank Congresswoman Terry Sewell and her very consistent efforts to restore the vote. Also to our chairwoman, Marsha Fudge of the Subcommittee on Elections for holding hearings throughout the country, which actually established the foundation for this bill. Now, the Voting Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Act, repaired damage in our communities whose voting rights were denied. Dr. Martin Luther King once said he saw that as a great step forward. However, in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby versus Holder decision. As a result, the nation saw nearly 20% fewer polling locations, and 17 million voters were purged from voting rolls in states with patterns of voter suppression. This is especially true for communities of color whose votes have been silenced over the years due to this disastrous court decision. Now, voting is the backbone of our democracy and something that every American should have the right to access. Now, I was born and raised in El Paso, Texas, and I vividly remember the denial of full citizenship to African Americans. We need a system that's strong, free, and fair. I urge my colleagues to move forward in a bipartisan way and pass H.R. 40.
Gentleman from Georgia of his time. The gentleman from New York is now recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield the remaining time to the distinguished Speaker of the House, Ms. Pelosi.
The gentlewoman from California, the Speaker of the House, is now recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Nadler, the distinguished chair of the Judiciary Committee, thank you for your leadership in bringing this important opportunity for America to the floor of the House today. I commend Congresswoman Terry Sewell for her tremendous leadership, the gentlewoman from Alabama, who knows this subject well personally, geographically, and officially now as a leading member of the House of Representatives. Thank you for your leadership. I thank Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, holding field hearings from Alabama to Arizona on this urgent issue of voting rights. That scope of Alabama to Arizona is not alphabetically of big range, but geographically and experience-wise it is. And to Congressman John Lewis, the conscience of the Congress, what an honor it is for each and every one of us to serve with him, to call him colleague, and for many cases, to call him friend. He is the civil rights hero of the House, whose Voter Empowerment Act was the backbone of H.R. 1, the For the People Act, because there is some resistance on the side of the aisle here to reducing the role of dark money in politics, which is a significant part of H.R. 1. We pulled out H.R. 4 as its own vehicle on the floor. And I thank all the House Democrats who came to Congress committed to restoring the right to the ballot, reflected in aiming of the legislation, H.R. 4, one of our top priorities. And I say Democrats, but it saddens me to hear the distinguished ranking member's comments about this legislation and urging a no vote on the Republican side, because I was leader when we passed the Voting Rights Act that this is the court sent us back to the drawing board on. And at that time, we had around 400 votes in the House of Representatives, upwards of 395, 400 votes, bipartisan, completely bipartisan vote to pass that bill. And it was unanimous in the United States Senate, not partisan in any way. And that we have come to a place where the court said, you need to do this or thus. We followed Justice Roberts' guidance, and now, with the improvements insisted upon by Justice Roberts, the Republicans have gone from being part of nearly 400-vote majority on the bill to hopefully not being unanimously against it, but we'll see. My colleagues, nearly 55 years ago, President Lyndon Johnson came to the House of Representatives. He came to this House and on the House floor to urge passage of the Voting Rights Act for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. He declared that this is the first nation in the history of the world to be founded with a purpose. All men are created equal. Those were not just clever words, he said. In their name, Americans have fought and died for 2 centuries. Those words were a promise to every citizen that he shall share in the dignity of man. He continued, our fathers believed that if this noble view of the rights of man were to flourish, we rooted in democracy, the right to choose your own leaders. The history of this country, he said, in large measure, is the history of the expansion of that right for all people. Yet a half-century later, the constitutional right of all Americans to determine their leaders and the destiny of our democracy is under grave assault from a brazen nationwide voter suppression campaign. Since the Shelby versus Holden decision, 23 states, maybe more, but at least 23 states have enacted voter suppression laws, including voter purges, strict ID requirements, poll closures, voter intimidation, denying millions their voices by their vote. The record compiled by the committees shows that the counties with the worst histories of voter suppression doubled down on their discrimination during this time, purging 17 million voters from the rolls between 2016 and 18 alone, primarily people of color. Today, the House is honoring our nation's sacred pledge, all are created equal, by passing H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act. This bill restores the Voting Rights Act's strength to combat the clear resurgence of voter discrimination unleashed by Shelby by updating the data determining which states and practices are covered by the law. No longer will cynical politicians and states with dark histories of discrimination have the green light to freely continue their systemic suppression campaign. When President Johnson spoke on this floor, he said, "There must be no delay, no hesitation, and no compromise with our purpose. We have already waited 100 years and more, and the time for waiting is gone." Indeed, it took the courage and ultimate sacrifice of countless Americans, including our own John Lewis, to secure the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Honoring and strengthening that legacy is essential to our democracy. We want to be sure that everyone who is eligible to vote can vote, and that that person's vote is counted as cast. Today, too, the time for waiting is gone. We must pass this bill, which is a vote for civil rights, liberty, and justice for all. Thank you, Mr. Nadler. Thank you, Marcia Fudge. And thank you, Terry Sewell, the author of this legislation, which he introduced now at the third Congress, for giving us the privilege to be part of honoring the pledge of our founders, all are created equal. With that, I urge an aye vote on the bill and yield back the balance of my time.
All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 741, the previous question is ordered on the bill as amended. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
To amend the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to revise the criteria for determining which states and political subdivisions are subject to Section 4 of the Act and for other purposes.
Pursuant to Clause 1C of Rule 19, further consideration of H.R. 4 is postponed. 1C of Rule 19, further consideration of H.R. 4 will now resume. The clerk will report the title.
Union Calendar number 258, H.R. 4, a bill to amend the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to revise the criteria for determining which states and political subdivisions are subject to Section 4 of the Act and for other purposes.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentleman opposed to the bill?
I am in its current form.
The gentleman qualifies. The clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois moves to recommit the bill H.R. 4 to the Committee on the Judiciary with instructions to report the same back.
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent. I ask unanimous consent to waive the reading of the motion to recommit.
Is there objection with dispensing to the reading? No objection? Without objection, the reading is
The House is not in order, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Pursuant. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. H.R. 4 is the fourth partisan attempt by this majority to federalize our elections. One thing all four of these partisan bills have in common is they all have good titles. In October, the majority jammed through H.R. 4617, the SHIELD Act, an attempt to federally hijack campaign finance law in this country. In June, the majority jammed through H.R. 2722, the SAFE Act, an attempt to federally hijack election infrastructure in this country. And in February, the majority jammed through H.R. 1, the For the People Act, a piece of legislation as introduced that would fund all of our campaigns with tax dollars from hardworking Americans. Catchy titles can't hide the facts, and the facts are that these 4 bills are bad partisan policy that would negatively affect the American people. When the Democrats proposed public financing of campaigns in H.R. 1, I could hardly believe it. The 6-to-1 small dollar campaign match program would create a mandatory donation from the American taxpayer to a political candidate. That means for every $200 donated to a campaign, the federal government, on the backs of taxpayers.
House will be in order. House will be in order.
For every $200 donated by hardworking Americans to any political campaign of all of us in this institution, the federal government, on the backs of the taxpayers, would give $1,200 to that same politician's campaign. This program would do nothing but fill the swamp, and any member who voted for it was voting to fill their own pockets and the pockets of political operatives nationwide. At Rules Committee, though, this was changed. The shell game now includes a fund which is supposedly financed through fines and settlements. But we have now seen the CBO score, and this fund does not support itself. So what happens when it fails? I'll tell you, it will ultimately fall to the taxpayers in this country to support this Democratic policy. But fines and settlements take us back to the legislation we hope to recommit to the committee today. There are members who would have you believe that there are currently no existing laws protecting the right for every American to vote, or that the Voting Rights Act is no longer in place. However, the Voting Rights Act...
House will be in order.
The Voting Rights Act is in effect today and protecting every American's right to vote. And it includes many important provisions.
Please take your conversations off the House floor. House will be in order. We will proceed after the House is in order. Gentlemen shall proceed.
Title I of the Voting Rights Act, 52 United States Code 10501A says, no citizen shall be denied because of his failure to comply with any test or device the right to vote in any election. That's still in effect today without H.R. 4, and it comes with a $5,000 fine if you don't follow that. Section 307A, no person shall prevent another who is entitled to vote from voting. Still in effect, $5,000 fine. Section 308B, no person shall destroy, deface, or alter official voting ballots. Still in effect, $5,000 fine. 307C, no person shall provide false information in registering to vote or in voting. Still in effect, $10,000 fine. 307E, no person shall vote more than once. Still in effect, $10,000 fine. 307D, no person shall falsify or conceal material facts. Still in effect, $10,000 fine. 307B, no person shall intimidate, threaten, or coerce any person for voting or attempting to vote. Still in effect. Do not let anyone tell you the Voting Rights Act is not alive and well in this country. What we have debated today is not a reauthorization of this important, historically bipartisan legislation that has prevented discrimination at the ballot box because it does not need reauthorization. Sections 2 and 3 of the VRA that are currently in effect are continuing to help safeguard the public from discrimination at the ballot box. Every eligible American who wants to vote in our country's elections should be able to cast their vote. This bill is only about preclearance and the Democrat majority giving the Department of Justice and the federal government control over all election activity. Jurisdictions under preclearance cannot move a polling location, expand vote-by-mail efforts, nor properly maintain their voting rolls without a partisan Department of Justice clearing everything they do. This is about control and taking power away from state and local election officials who they don't like and putting it in the hands of the federal government. This bill does not reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. What does it do? It opens the doors for fines and settlements in this country, including under this act, to be hijacked once again by my colleagues for their own political campaigns if they get their way. My motion to recommit is simple. Make it clear to your constituents that fines and settlements under the VRA will not be going to your own campaign coffers. I yield back.
The gentleman from Illinois yields back. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Alabama seek recognition?
I oppose the amendment.
We can get the House in order. We will proceed after the House is in order and conversations are taken off the House floor. The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I oppose this amendment because it's a mere distraction. It is an attempt to politicize the Voting Rights Act of 1965 by interjecting campaign finance and settlement terms into a civil rights legislation. If the Republicans were really serious about voting rights, they would actually be willing to come to the table and talk about how we can fully restore Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Leave it up to our colleagues across the aisle to interject money and finance into civil rights law. What has been lost today in this debate is the very heart of this bill. It is the central meaning of the bill. Let's not forget the brave patriots of the civil rights and voting rights movement who marched, prayed, died for the right to vote. These foot soldiers for equality, like our very own John Lewis, were ordinary citizens who dared to achieve extraordinary social change by forcing this nation to live up to its ideals of equality and justice for all. We know, Mr. Speaker, that the price of freedom is not free. It has been paid for and bought by those brave foot soldiers so that one day a little black girl from Selma, Alabama, could one day sit in this august body. I know I am not the only black and brown colleague of ours that owes our very presence in this chamber to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Mr. Speaker, old battles have become new again. We fight for the same equity that these foot soldiers fought for in Selma. Progress is elusive. Every generation must fight to maintain the progress that we've had and to seek to advance it. Since the Supreme Court's decision in 2013 in Shelby versus Holder, states across this country have enacted harsh measures that make it more difficult to vote. Mr. Speaker,
we can have order in the House. Please take our conversations off the House floor so we shall proceed. Gentlewoman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I dare say that Selma is still now. Since the Shelby decision, 25 states have put in stricter voter restrictions laws. Selma is still now, because since the Shelby decision, 12 states have laws making it harder for citizens to register and stay registered. Selma is now. Since the Shelby's decision, 10 more states have made it more difficult for early and absentee voting. While today there are no poll taxes or literacy tests, these modern-day barriers to voting are no less discriminatory or suppressive than those old practices. Voting rights should be a nonpartisan issue. And the fact that in this amendment they would try to politicize voting rights, we should all be appalled by that. Voting rights have been always very nonpartisan. And it used to be that the Voting Rights Acts passed overwhelmingly with Republicans and Democrats. In fact, the VRA was reauthorized 5 times, yes, under Republican and Democratic presidents. So what's changed? I asked my colleagues across the aisle, what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of letting more Americans voting? Why are you afraid to let more Americans vote? Is it because your own political interests are only realized when you limit access to the ballot box? I say shame on you. Shame on you. Could it be that what we need more than anything else is to look at our North Star? That is John Lewis. Mr. Lewis, we are all honored every day to be able to call you colleague. And the reality is that what happened on that bridge in Selma, Alabama in 1965 is still occurring today. If one person who's an American, who is a voter, is not allowed to vote, it goes to the very heart of the integrity of all of our elections. We should all want to make sure that every American can vote. So let us make sure that we remember what Elijah Cummings would say. He would say, we are better than this. We are better than this. We are better than having an amendment that deals with politicizing Civil Rights Act is appalling. I ask my colleagues to vote no on the amendment and to remember the words of another civil rights activist, Amelia Boynton Robinson, who also was bludgeoned on that bridge with John Lewis in 1965, who came to this chamber in 2015 as my special guest at the State of the Union. Many of you on both sides of the aisle were willing to host her. I say to you what she said. When people said that I stand on your shoulders, she said, get off my shoulders. Do your own work. I say now, Miss Amelia, we're doing our own work because we're voting to restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Just a reminder for members to address their remarks to the chair. Without objection, the previous question is ordered on the motion to recommit. The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The gentleman from Illinois. The noes have it.
No,
Gentlewoman from
a recorded
Alabama.
vote. I'm asking for a recorded vote, Mr.
A
Speaker.
recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, the chair will reduce to 5 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote on the question of passage. This is a 5-minute vote.
And House votes now on a procedural motion that would seek to make changes to the voting rights bill, which the White House is threatening to veto. The bill itself would restore Justice Department oversight of voting rights legislation. Back in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down that portion of the Voting Rights Act. In this vote, Republicans want to ensure that fines or penalties associated with the Voting Rights Act do not get directed to congressional campaign financing. A vote on final passage is expected shortly after this. These are the last votes for the day and for the week in the House, and when members return next week, they're expected to take up prescription drug pricing legislation, which is one of the House Democrats' top 10 legislative priorities for this Congress. A quick reminder, while we have a moment, this coming Monday, the House Judiciary Committee will be meeting to receive the Intelligence Committee impeachment inquiry report. Members will hear from Democratic and Republican counsels on the findings. Our live coverage of that begins at 9 a.m. Eastern here on C-SPAN, also online at cspan.org, or you can listen in live with the free C-SPAN radio app.
On this vote, the yeas are 200 and the nays are 215. The motion is not adopted. The question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
I'd like to ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
Votes now on final passage of the bill that would restore Justice Department oversight of voting rights legislation. In 2013, the Supreme Court struck down that portion of the Voting Rights Act. These are the last votes for the day and for the week in the House.
On this vote, the yeas are 228, the nays are 187. The bill is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.